Night presses against the perspex as a 518 Squadron Halifax shoulders through cloud, 4 engines biting foam-laced air. Lamps are hooded. The cockpit is a dim constellation of luminous paint and trembling needles. Wind claws at the airframe. Icing nibbles the edges. The pilot feels it in the yoke, heavier, a shiver in the trim, and watches the reserve he promised himself shrink to a sliver. Behind him, the meteorological observer hunches over a clipboard. He reads the sky like an accountant reads a ledger, indifferent to the uproar. Outside air temperature, wind at this level by drift and stopwatch, pressured tendency, cloud height in a world with no horizon. He dictates. The wireless operator gives it shape, tapping a crisp stream into the night, dots and dashes, figures and signs hustling east toward England. They are numbers fighting weather. The navigator's pencil skates across a chart, then stops. "Turn back point," he says, voice flat in the intercom. "Now or we pay it back in the water." The pilot glances to the fuel gauge with its treacherous lag, to the engine instruments, to the compass card that swings before settling. Headwind stronger than forecast. Time eaten by climbs and descents to dodge icing. He can feel doctrine tugging him home now. Static rises. Through it, a clipped voice from the wireless. Request for another reading farther west, lower level if possible. One more line of data that might bend a forecast. The meteorological observer meets the pilot's eyes with the same steady look he wears for ice and turbulence. No drama, just the work. Chaos bangs on the hull. Precision answers with a slide rule. He leans the mixtures, trades speed for endurance, and nudges the Halifax beeper into the weather. The altimeter uncoils 100 feet at a time. Buffet creeps in at the edges. The pitot heat holds. In a brief tear in the cloud, they glimpse the sea, whitecaps streaking like brushed steel. The navigator calls a new wind. The observer revises. The wireless keys the amended code. Fuel ticks downward. The payback is real now. The pilot measures it in minutes, not miles. Engine steady, crew quiet. Every movement is deliberate, a ritual meant to keep the chaos outside the glass. The final set is clean. Wind easing a fraction, pressure edging up. Cloud building a lid rather than a wall. The wireless pushes it into the dark, numbers vanishing into static, then into cables, then into minds that will move men. Somewhere ashore, maps wait for this line to move tonight. The pilot banks east, calculating whether arithmetic and luck will run out at the same time. He hopes the numbers arrive before he does. What left that Halifax were winds at height, pressure tendency, cloud base, temperature. The grammar of the atmosphere turned into code groups. That is the secret message. Not romance, not spycraft, but digits precise enough to prise open a 12-18-hour gap in the worst North Atlantic weather. That message travels from the bomber to Dunstable to Southwick House. The chain works because it is practiced. The observer encodes a Met form in the air. The wireless pushes it into ether. A coastal station receives and forwards by landline to the Met Office Center at Dunstable. There, through the small hours, clerks and forecasters transpose figures to charts, fill isobars by hand, and compare them with ship reports and balloon ascents under deadline pressure. Group Captain James Stagg, on loan to SHAFE as Chief Meteorological Advisor, gathers the outputs into a coherent narrative and carries it to Southwick House before dawn for a final brief. Here is the stake. The invasion plan is doctrine-bound to moon, tide, and dawn. Paratroops need moonlight. Landing craft need a rising tide after first light. Those constraints left a narrow set of dates, and the Armada had already begun to move. Calling it off meant dislocation measured in divisions and fuel convoys. Calling it wrong meant men drowned off shingle or scattered through low cloud behind German lines. The message matters because it tips the balance between two bad options. Myth loves a whispered phrase that launches history. Reality here is a soft pencil on a map. a millibar line bending north where yesterday it fell away. The push and pull is constant. Neat timetables and checklists versus rough air and human judgment. Doctrine says depart on the 5th. Improvisation says wait for a break that may not come again for weeks. Stagg must translate numbers into risk, and Eisenhower must translate risk into lives. There is another tension, quieter but sharper. Allied forecasting is abundant. Aircraft, weather ships, island stations feeding Dunstable. German forecasters, with ships sunk and stations denied, must extrapolate from the continent and the North Sea. That asymmetry creates advantage as real as armor. If the Allied message is right, the enemy expects storm when a short lull arrives. If it is wrong, the enemy's confidence will not matter. Surf and sky will be the enemy. The pilot in that Halifax is not thinking about destiny. He is doing fuel arithmetic and keeping ice off the airframe. The observer is not writing poetry in code. He is counting seconds on a stopwatch and reading a barometer that bucks with every gust. Their craft is modest, almost dull, until a roomful of officers hangs an operation on the weight of their figures. Our promise is simple and severe. We will reconstruct one flight and one message with enough fidelity to respect the people who risked for it. We will show how a handwritten cipher became a plotted line, became a forecast brief, became a decision to delay from 5 June to 6 June. We will measure what that delay bought, just enough ceiling for bombers to find their marks, winds low enough for landing craft to hold course through surf. The stakes are not abstract. They ride with the men already at sea, with air crews briefed for paratroop drops, with French civilians waiting for a sign that the storm might bring liberation instead of more ruin. If numbers could make room for courage, this was the hour. To see how and why they did, we widen the frame and mark the forces that boxed everyone in. The clock for Overlord kept time with the moon, the tide, and a storm. The airborne drops needed moonlight after midnight. The beach assaults wanted low water near first light to expose obstacles, with a rising tide behind to float landing craft off sandbars. Those astronomical facts narrowed acceptable dates to the first week of June 1944. Then the atmosphere imposed a veto. A vigorous Atlantic low spun fronts toward the channel, promising heavy seas, low cloud, showers, and winds that would shear parachutes and blow coxswains off their lines. Allied doctrine was explicit about conditions. Fighters needed ceilings that allowed rendezvous and cover. Bomber groups required visibility to mark targets without blanketing friendly forces. Naval commanders asked for sea states that would let small craft hold course through surf without swamping. The airborne forces wanted winds at jump altitude below a punishing threshold and cloud layers thin enough for navigation by stars or beacons. Nobody expected perfection. The forecast had to be good enough everywhere that mattered for long enough across an armada already leaving port. The synoptic picture from 1 to 6 June told a simple, cruel story. Pressure fell as a deep low tracked northeast, with a tight gradient driving gales over the western approaches and the channel. Behind the first cold front lay showers, low scud, and turbulence. Behind that, a secondary wave promised another blow. There was, however, a narrow chance that a ridge would nose in after the front passed, slackening winds and lifting cloud just long enough to try. The difference between those outcomes was measured in hours and millibars. To see which way the scales tipped, the Allies built an information machine. Coastal stations from Ireland to Cornwall sent hourly reports. Island outposts in Iceland, the Faroes, and Greenland fed the upstream picture. Merchantmen and escorts transmitted weather codes when radio silence allowed. And where the map was blankest, far west of the British Isles, long-range aircraft went to read the sky. From windswept bases like RAF Tyree, Halifax bombers of 518 Squadron flew meteorological reconnaissance on fixed tracks, sampling air at multiple levels and returning with the one commodity command could not otherwise buy: current data from the source. The Halifax carried little glamour and no guns for this work. Its fit mattered. A barograph traced pressure changes against time. A thermometer and psychrometer captured temperature and humidity in the slipstream. The navigator used an astrocompass and sextant between cloud breaks, and a drift meter over the sea to calculate wind. The meteorological observer took these fragments and turned them into code groups: wind direction and speed by level, temperature, pressure tendency, cloud type, and base. The wireless operator keyed them across long-range frequencies where shore stations received and relayed by landline to the central forecasters. At Dunstable, the wartime Met Office hub, clerks and forecasters plotted the figures by hand. Isobars crept across fresh charts as new numbers arrived. Ship reports were weighted against aircraft readings. Pilot balloons and soundings added vertical structure. The outcome was not a single modern model output, but a reasoned synthesis under deadline pressure. Group Captain James Stagg assembled that synthesis each night and took it to Southwick House, where Eisenhower and his commanders listened, challenged, and measured risk with a pencil on a timetable already in motion. The Germans faced the same elements with poorer sightlines. Their dedicated weather ships had been hunted down. Several Arctic and Greenland stations were lost or isolated. U-boat reports were patchy and dangerous to send. From occupied coasts westward into the Atlantic, their picture thinned to guesswork. Forecasters in Paris and Hamburg extrapolated from continental data and the North Sea, a habit that tended to underrate rapid changes far to the west. When gales battered the channel on the 4th and 5th, German confidence in continued bad weather hardened. That confidence shaped decisions up and down the chain. This asymmetry, abundance versus scarcity, was as decisive as any armored advantage. With more eyes upstream, Allied forecasters could spot the brief rise in pressure and easing winds that might open a gap. With fewer, the Germans were more likely to miss a short-lived ridge and to expect persistence. The result was not clairvoyance, but a better bet. And in combined operations, a better bet can be the difference between a costly postponement and a catastrophe. Constraints on the Allied side were unforgiving. Convoys had sortied, landing craft were marshaled, fuel and ammunition trains rolled day and night to ports that could not simply disgorge and reload without loss. Airfields were stacked with sorties that had to be flown or scrubbed. Paratroopers were briefed and harnessed. A delay of 24 hours was feasible, barely. A delay of weeks risked security and momentum. The forecast thus carried operational gravity out of proportion to the quiet rooms in which it was drawn. The architecture was set, the fleet already moving, and the enemy reading the same storm through a smaller keyhole. What remained was execution. A crew on Thierry, instruments double-checked, fuel guessed against weather, ready to lift into the dark and bring home numbers intact. We call him Mac because names blur in the logbooks, but the decisions don't. He is 22, the age when RAF pilots look too young for their rank, yet carry 4 engines and 4 lives into weather that chews brass harder than flak. He flies a Halifax lightened for range, most guns stripped out, ballast where glamour used to be, instruments where bombs would sit. His war is arithmetic and ice. Tonight his brief is simple to read and hard to do. Step west into the western approaches, read the sky, come back with numbers. On Thierry, the wind never really stops. In the ops hut under a low bulb, a forecast officer traces isobars that look like claw marks. Icing severe in layers, winds aloft backing with height, cloud banks stacked like decks. The navigator copies track legs and pencil, measureless miles across black water. Mac listens for the quiet parts of the brief. Altimeter settings by hour, lowest safe altitudes, radio schedules. Doctrine speaks through checklists. Fuel loads, de-icing systems, oxygen, drift sites, standard levels for observations. The crew is 4. Mac at the yoke, a navigator with a calm voice and a restless pencil, a meteorological observer who treats the sky like a ledger, and a wireless operator whose hands translate facts to signals. Their kit is ordinary and exact. Mae Wests crinkle at their elbows. A circular slide rule rides in a map case. The observer checks his barograph crumb tick, calibrates the thermometer in the slipstream well, sets spare pencils like cartridges across his board. Little rituals tame large risks. Mac runs his own ritual. Fuel math first. He counts the outbound legs, the climbs and descents that burn more than the plan admits, the headwind penalty the briefing guessed, but could not swear to. He draws a neat slash on the chart, turnback point. He marks another for the level where icing was forecast worst. Doctrine gives him these lines. Experience knows they move. Out there, if rime starts to creep, they will drop for a warmer layer even if it knocks them off a standard height. If the wind shears, they will trade a clean track for survival. The Halifax for Met work is a machine built to notice. The barograph will trace pressure's slow rise or fall. The observer will watch that curve like a cardiogram. A drift meter will turn whitecaps into wind vectors. Between cloud breaks, the navigator will shoot stars and feed fixes into a mind already triangulating by instinct. The wireless operator will keep an ear on schedules, ready to punch numbers into the night as code groups. Their only weapon is precision. The enemy is a moving, indifferent element that pays no attention to orders. In the squadrons past, the logbooks read like weather reports disguised as war. Entries were brief, almost shy. Heavy icing, moderate turbulence, message sent, fuel tight. The enemy rarely gets a mention. Losses came in ones and twos, aircraft that did not return because engines strangled on ice or a headwind stretched the arithmetic too far. Nobody pins medals for turning back at the right moment, and nobody writes long about the quiet flights that made maps bend. Yet those pages are why we can build Mac without lying about him. They move through the cold toward the dispersal. The Halifax sits slack and patient, exhaust stubs silvered by frost, ridge lines of salt on the wing from older storms. Ground crew in heavy coats move like practiced stagehands. The navigator climbs to his table and straps in among charts and a faint smell of pencil shavings. The observer checks the pressure drum, then the spare pens. The wireless operator tunes a set that will crackle with voices they'll never meet. Max settles, tests the controls, and watches the gauges as the four engines cough, catch, and smooth. The request cuts through the static. One more line of data. Farther west, lower if possible. Mac looks at the pencil slash on his chart, the turned back line, and at the twitching fuel gauge. The Halifax bucks in rough air. Doctrine says keep the reserve. The clock says the reserve is already thin. He feels the choice land in his hands like weight. Minutes traded for miles, numbers traded for safety. In the small hours ashore, the invasion is on hold. At Southwick House, Stagg needs confirmation that the Atlantic is turning, not just easing. A ridge may be nosing in behind the front. If so, winds will back and pressure will rise, giving a cramped window on the 6th. The plots at Dunstable hinted it, but need a far western reading. If the figures agree, he can recommend a go with reasons. If not, caution hardens into delay. Turn back now keeps mandatory reserve, the navigator says, pencil steady. Push to the next fix and we land light, or not at all. The Met observer watches the barograph's quivering line. The wireless operator listens for amended schedules. Precision has carried them here. Chaos scratches at the windows. Mac hears both. He leans the mixtures, sets a slightly slower cruise, and watches the engines settle into a deeper hum. Then the weather flickers in their favor. Dropping a few hundred feet to dodge icing, they find smoother air. True airspeed for the fuel improves. Tail coming on the way home if we time it, the navigator adds. Doctrine holds up a rule. Necessity whispers that one more reading could move a pin on a wall that decides fleets. Mac nods once. We'll take it. Next waypoint. The observer resets his forms. The wireless taps a brief acknowledgement into the dark, promising transmission at schedule. The Halifax shoulders onward, a black shape in a darker sky. Fuel arithmetic ticks under every sound. The turnback line lingers like a rebuke, but the course remains west. At Dunstable and Southwick, the effect is incremental but real. Clerks hung fresh isobars. Ship reports and pilot balloons feed vertical structure. The western approach is still rage, but a few stations show falls easing, rises beginning. Stagg, cautious by habit, is not hunting miracles. He wants alignment, pressure rising across multiple sources, winds turning through expected points, cloud forming a lid instead of a wall. One aircraft does not decide an invasion, it underwrites judgment. They tip over an invisible fix. Between gaps in cloud, the navigator snatches a star, then returns to dead reckoning and drift. The observer reads the sky like routine. Temperature, wind by drift, Cloud type and base, pressure, tendency, 3-hour, and current. Each figure is a quiet brick in Skag's case. The wireless turns them to code groups and shoves them east, where receivers will hiss them into wires and hands. Fuel bleeds, ice traces along the leading edge, then recedes as the warmer layer holds. The gyros behave. For a moment, the cockpit feels almost domestic. Faint glow, even engines, the smell of gear oil. Mac recomputes. The cushion shrinks to something he can live with if the return carries a tail. The calculus is ugly and honest. Risk a few gallons now to make morning less murderous for men in small boats. Static flares. A second request. Confirmed last group, and if able, one more pass at the lowest safe level. The navigator's finger finds a path that dips to the inversion, steals a reading, and claws back. Adds minutes, he says. Mac watches the frost recede on the wing root. He pushes the nose down. The altimeter unwinds. The sea appears as graphite under a gray lid. The observer reads again, voice level. On land, markers move a fraction. The ridge looks less like a wish and more like a shape. Caution remains, but now it carries a plan, not a veto. Mac finally turns east, just past the line the pencil called wisdom, riding the first hint of tailwind toward home, lighter by fuel. The Germans faced the same elements with poorer sight lines. Their dedicated weather ships had been hunted down. Several Arctic and Greenland stations were lost or isolated. U-boat reports were patchy and dangerous to send. From occupied coasts westward into the Atlantic, their picture thinned to guesswork. Forecasters in Paris and Hamburg extrapolated from continental data and the North Sea, a habit that tended to underrate rapid changes far to the west. When gales battered the Channel on the 4th and 5th, German confidence in continued bad weather hardened. That confidence shaped decisions up and down the chain. This asymmetry, abundance versus scarcity, was as decisive as any armored advantage. With more eyes upstream, Allied forecasters could spot the brief rise in pressure and easing winds that might open a gap. With fewer, the Germans were more likely to miss a short-lived ridge and to expect persistence. The result was not clairvoyance, but a better bet. And in combined operations, a better bet can be the difference between a costly postponement and a catastrophe. Constraints on the Allied side were unforgiving. Convoys had sortied. Landing craft were marshaled. Fuel and ammunition trains rolled day and night to ports that could not simply disgorge and reload without loss. Airfields were stacked with sorties that had to be flown or scrubbed. Paratroopers were briefed and harnessed. A delay of 24 hours was feasible, barely. A delay of weeks risked security and momentum. The forecast thus carried operational gravity out of proportion to the quiet rooms in which it was drawn. The architecture was set, the fleet already moving, and the enemy reading the same storm through a smaller keyhole. What remained was execution, a crew on Tyree, instruments double-checked, fuel guessed against weather, ready to lift into the dark and bring home numbers intact. We call him Mac because names blur in the logbooks, but the decisions don't. He is 22, the age when RAF pilots look too young for their rank, yet carry 4 engines and 4 lives into weather that chews brass harder than flak. He flies a Halifax lightened for range, most guns stripped out, ballast where glamour used to be, instruments where bombs would sit. His war is arithmetic and ice. Tonight, his brief is simple to read and hard to do. Step west into the western approaches, read the sky, come back with numbers. On Tyree, the wind never really stops. In the ops hut, under a low bulb, a forecast officer traces isobars that look like claw marks. Icing severe in layers, winds aloft backing with height. Cloud banks stacked like decks. The navigator copies track legs in pencil. Measureless miles across black water. Mac listens for the quiet parts of the brief. Altimeter settings by hour. Lowest safe altitudes. Radio schedules. Doctrine speaks through checklists. Fuel loads, de-icing systems, oxygen, drift sites, standard levels for observations. The crew was 4. Mac at the yoke, a navigator with a calm voice and a restless pencil, a meteorological observer who treats the sky like a ledger, and a wireless operator whose hands translate facts to signals. Their kit is ordinary and exact. Mae Wests crinkle at their elbows. A circular slide rule rides in a map case. The observer checks his barograph drum tick, calibrates the thermometer in the slipstream well, sets spare pencils like cartridges across his board. Little rituals tame large risks. Mac runs his own ritual, fuel math first. He counts the outbound legs, the climbs and descents that burn more than the plan admits, the headwind penalty the briefing guessed but could not swear to. He draws a neat slash on the chart. Turn back point. He marks another for the level where icing was forecast worst. Doctrine gives him these lines. Experience knows they move. Out there, if rime starts to creep, they will drop for a warmer layer, even if it knocks them off a standard height. If the wind shears, they will trade a clean track for survival. The Halifax Formet work is a machine built to notice. The barograph will trace pressure's slow rise or fall. The observer will watch that curve like a cardiogram. A drift meter will turn whitecaps into wind vectors. Between cloud breaks, the navigator will shoot stars and feed fixes into a mind already triangulating by instinct. The wireless operator will keep an ear on schedules, ready to punch numbers into the night as code groups. Their only weapon is precision. The enemy is a moving, indifferent element that pays no attention to orders. In the squadron's past, the logbooks read like weather reports disguised as war. Entries were brief, almost shy. Heavy icing, moderate turbulence, message sent, fuel tight. The enemy rarely gets a mention. Losses came in ones and twos, aircraft that did not return because engines strangled on ice or a headwind stretched the arithmetic too far. Nobody pins medals for turning back at the right moment, and nobody writes long about the quiet flights that made maps bend. Yet those pages are why we can build Mac without lying about him. They move through the cold toward the dispersal. The Halifax sits black and patient, exhaust stubs silvered by frost, ridge lines of salt on the wing from older storms. Ground crew in heavy coats move like practiced stagehands. The navigator climbs to his table and straps in among charts and a faint smell of pencil shavings. The observer checks the pressure drum, then the spare pens. The wireless operator tunes a set that will crackle with voices they'll never meet. Mac settles, tests the controls, and watches the gauges as the four engines cough, catch, and smooth. The request cuts through the static. One more line of data, farther west, lower if possible. Mac looks at the pencil slash on his chart, the turn back line, and at the twitching fuel gauge. The Halifax bucks in rough air. Doctrine says keep the reserve. The clock says the reserve is already thin. He feels the choice land in his hands like weight. Minutes traded for miles, numbers traded for safety. In the small hours ashore, the invasion is on hold. At Southwick House, Stagg needs confirmation that the Atlantic is turning, not just easing. A ridge may be nosing in behind the front. If so, winds will back and pressure will rise, giving a cramped window on the 6th. The plots at Dunstable hint at it, but need a far western reading. If the figures agree, he can recommend a go with reasons. If not, caution hardens into delay. Turn back now keeps mandatory reserve, the navigator says, pencil steady. Push to the next fix and we land light, or not at all. The Met observer watches the barograph's quivering line. The wireless operator listens for amended schedules. Precision has carried them here. Chaos scratches at the windows. Mac hears both. He leans the mixtures, sets a slightly slower cruise, and watches the engines settle into a deeper hum. Then the weather flickers in their favor. Dropping a few hundred feet to dodge icing, they find smoother air. True airspeed for the fuel improves. Tail coming on the way home if we time it, the navigator adds. Doctrine holds up a rule. Necessity whispers that one more reading could move a pen on a wall that decides fleets. Mac nods once. We'll take it. Next waypoint. The observer resets his forms. The wireless taps a brief acknowledgement into the dark, promising transmission at schedule. The Halifax shoulders onward, a black shape in a darker sky. Fuel bleeds. Ice traces along the leading edge, then recedes as the warmer layer holds. The gyros behave. For a moment, the cockpit feels almost domestic. Faint glow, even engines, the smell of gear oil. Mac recomputes. The cushion shrinks to something he can live with if the return carries a tail. The calculus is ugly and honest. Risk a few gallons now to make morning less murderous for men in small boats. Static flares. A second request. Confirm last group, and if able, one more pass at the lowest safe level. The navigator's finger finds a path that dips to the inversion, steals a reading, and claws back. Adds minutes, he says. Mac watches frost recede on the wing root. He pushes the nose down. The altimeter unwinds. The sea appears as graphite under a gray lid. The observer reads again, voice level. On land, markers move a fraction. The ridge looks less like a wish and more like a shape. Caution remains, but now it carries a plan, not a veto. Mac finally turns east, just past the line the pencil called wisdom, riding the first hint of tailwind toward home, lighter by fuel and heavier by meaning, and ready to turn raw weather into the numbers that matter. Ahead waits dark air and the discipline of flying the numbers all the way back. Wheels up from Tyree, and the Halifax climbs into black weather, engines threaded to the same hard note. The runway vanishes in a heartbeat. The island is a darker patch of dark behind them. Rain needles the canopy and then becomes cloud, a heavy, indifferent mass that swallows the aircraft whole. The pilot holds climb speed, watches the rate of ascent sag, and feels the yoke go gummy as supercooled droplets glaze the leading edge. Standard drills come alive as habits. Pitot heat on. Boots cycling. The pilot calls for a lower level to unstick the wing and keep lift honest. The Halifax eases down, trading altitude for warmer air where ice forms slower and sheds faster. Doctrine said stay at planned levels for clean data. Survival says move until the airplane flies clean and collect what you can from air that will carry you. On the ground in England, the developing picture had been ugly and precise. Forecasters plotted a deep low, pushing fractures of front through the western approaches, a tight gradient driving gales. What mattered to Stagg was not poetry, but trend. Wind speeds at height, the turn of direction through expected points, the rate of pressure rise that would betray a ridge nosing in behind the blow. Each variable tugged at his isobars and at the timetable for men and ships already committed. The navigator calls out heading and drift. He lies prone over the drift meter, turns the black disk until Whitecaps tracks straight in its frame, and reads an angle that says how far the wind is pushing them sideways. He marries that to airspeed and heading, then draws a wind triangle, fast and clean. Between violent clouds, he steals a star shot with the bubble sextant, a rough line that anchors dead reckoning. In this cockpit, improvisation keeps the plan on life support. The Met observer touches cold metal and writes neat figures as if the airplane were not shaking. Outside air temperature by the slipstream well, cloud tops and base by sensation and glimpses, wind by level from the navigator's estimates, pressure tendency from the barograph drum's ticked trace, a thin pen stitching a rise or fall into paper. He mutters codes, turns English into numbers, and prepares the Met form groups that will travel faster than they are flying. Stagg's team had learned to treat pressure tendency as the pulse of a day. A slow, persistent rise across aircraft and ships could mean the ridge was real and strengthening, lifting cloud, slackening wind, and calming seas enough for craft to steer and paratroops to find drop zones. A continued fall, or seesaw, meant the frontal zone had stalled or deepened, keeping the channel under a lid of scud and gusts that would shear parachutes, scatter pathfinders, and drown men in surf. The slope of the front mattered too. A shallow slope smothers, a steeper one clears faster. The Halifax hits a pocket of turbulence that rattles the instrument panel. The pilot sets a slightly richer mixture to keep cylinders warm, checks carb heat, and watches the ice line creep and then recede as the temperature nicks upward. The airplane likes this layer. It is not the planned altitude, but it is flyable. He steadies the course. The navigator recalculates drift. The observer notes the level change in his log. The wireless operator listens for the scheduled window with a finger poised over the key. They make their first transmission cleanly. Wind at level 1, strong, from a quarter that promises tough seas. Temperature, low, with little spread. Pressure tendency, fall eased, now steady to slight rise. Cloud, layered, tops ragged, base stubborn. The code groups leave the Halifax as sharp taps and pass into the night, then into a receiver's hiss ashore, where the numbers will meet others and gain meaning. At Dunstable, the ritual was methodical and human. Clerks wrote and overwrote. Analysts balanced aircraft winds against ship winds that felt the sea directly. Balloons lifted into the night at a few key stations and came back in curves that told of shear and stability. Stagg triangulated these reports into a narrative of the front, how fast it was moving, how steep the slope was, whether the ridge could grow a spine by the early hours of the 6th. He was cautious, almost to a fault, because the cost of being wrong wore faces. Irving Crick's American team still argued for the 5th, at least, on earlier days, using analog patterns pulled from past storms that looked similar on paper. Find a cluster of years when the charts match, they said, and you predict by family resemblance. British forecasters bristled. The Atlantic in 1914 was not obliged to rhyme with 1917. The debate was real but professional. Models of thinking in conflict while ships rolled and aircraft burned fuel to feed both. Then the cockpit throws its own challenge. The fuel pressure needle dances for a beat and comes back. The pilot's hand is already on the pump switch. He doesn't need to use it. He leans the mixtures a shade and watches the engine settle. No drama, just a reminder that the margin is not large. He keeps the airplane exactly where the air is friendliest and asks the navigator for the next turn in seconds, not miles. They climb when the observer needs a second level. The ice returns as glaze, clear and treacherous, heavier than rime and lazier to shed. Boots cycle again. The Halifax shudders and then cleans up. The navigator marks the fix time with a pencil that leaves a small dent in soft paper. The observer reads pressure off the drum and feels the prickling sense that the line is tilting up, not down, by fractions you would miss if you were not staring. He doesn't call it hope, he calls it rising slowly. Each detail had weight. Wind speed aloft told how fast weather would translate from west to east, and how ships would fight the sea. Direction told where cloud decks would feed and where clearances might tear open. Temperature by level told icing hazard and the probability of cloud thinning behind a front. Pressure rise was the anchor. Only a consistent rise across the western array of reports would justify telling Eisenhower there was a window wide enough to drive a fleet through and not get the door slammed on it by midday. The wireless operator sends again, then repeats a group when static bruises the cadence. He knows receivers will ask for repeats only if they must. Band discipline matters tonight. He listens to the carrier and watches the tiny lamp wink with each tap, a private Morse aurora. He imagines a clerk's pencil catching up with his rhythm, and the thought steadies him. The crew fights to give the numbers their best shot. Altitude changes are small, deliberate, marked. Speed varies within narrow bands to protect both instrument integrity and range. Doctrine gives the skeleton, levels to sample, times to transmit, codes to use. Improvisation puts meat on it. Duck here, climb there, pause for a star, hurry a fix before the cloud closes like a fist. Past the midpoint of the outbound track, the clouds thin for seconds at a time. The navigator finds Arcturus in a hole, centers its reflection in the sextant's bubble, and calls mark. Another line drawn across the chart, another swipe at uncertainty. He does not need perfect. He needs close enough that the winds he and the observer derive are not lies. He writes the figures and feels the aircraft skate a little as turbulence jabs the tail. Back ashore, the map at Southwick House told a story that changed by increments, not revelations. Markers edged forward along a forecast front. Naval officers eyed the sea state predictions with narrowed eyes. Air commanders asked for cloud base and ceiling like a catechism. Stagg spoke with care, listing what the latest reports supported and where assumptions lived. The new data from aircraft like this Halifax did not settle arguments. They moved the center of gravity of the room 1 millibar at a time. Another mini-crisis spikes attention. The icing worsens without warning, the kind of surge that can erase lift faster than a paragraph can describe. The pilot chooses an ugly drop into a warmer layer, watches the altimeter unwind and holds the descent steady with a thumb and 2 fingers that read the controls like Braille. The edges go clean again. The navigator rewrites the planned level and recalculates wind at the new height. The observer adds deviation from standard to his log with half a smile. Doctrine will forgive them if the number saves someone else's doctrine from breaking. Frontal slope becomes real in those minutes. A shallow slope meant a broad, deep cloud deck and a slow, sullen clearance that would keep the sky low and soldiers blind. A steeper slope promised a brisker passage, a chance for brakes and for winds to fall off enough to let landing craft maintain bearings through surf. That change could look like nothing from the ground at night, and like everything on a pressure trace and a wind report at height. They reach another reporting point, invisible but felt as time and bearing intersect. The observer works the form again, wind vector, temperature, cloud notes, and the pulse of pressure. He uses the word rising again, not boastful, not convinced, just precise. The wireless pushes it out. If the receivers miss it, they will ask. If they get it, the line on a wall across the channel will bend by millimeters that matter. Crick's analogs did not die in stubbornness. They simply yielded under weight. As more data flowed in from aircraft, ships, and islands, the argument for a narrow window on the 6th gained mass. American and British forecasters, argumentative by trade, converged on the conclusion even if their roads there were different. The pressure rise and wind shift were not uniform, not clean, but coherent. The Atlantic, in other words, was speaking with a single voice across enough stations to trust. The Halifax holds the western end of its run for a heartbeat, then swings to the next leg like a boxer rolling a shoulder. Rain becomes sleet against the perspex. Cloud becomes sheets and then rags. The pilot breathes in through his nose and out through his mouth, a ritual of steadiness. The crew is quiet in the way experienced hands are quiet when they are stretched, but within limits. They do not need to say they are close to the fuel plan's bones. Everyone can read gauges. The observer looks once more at the barograph, at the thin ink that is the spine of the night. He thinks of it in plain terms. Rising yields a try, falling yields a wait, and then pushes the thought away as unhelpful. His work is to read and send. The rest is for rooms with maps and men who weigh war like accountants. They turn at the last agreed point on the outbound legs. The navigator checks the drift again and hints at a tail on the way back if they catch the right height. The pilot files that where he keeps hope, close, but not where it can interfere with flying. Numbers have left the airplane and started their other life now. More will follow if the return allows. Somewhere to the east, pencils hover over charts, and an invasion breathes in and holds. The westernmost fix creeps under the Halifax like an invisible buoy. Fuel sits low enough to make hands feel slow. The pilot trims for endurance, nudges mixture and prop to the sweet spot, and lets the nose scrape a fraction down into air that flies cleaner. The gauges say the reserve is a rumor. The plan says turn east. The order says one more set. They hold the point just long enough to earn it. Ice threatens again without ceremony. A glaze crawls along the wing's leading edge, the sort that steals lift by stealth. One engine coughs one dry hitch, and the cockpit stills for half a second. Carb heat on. Boots cycle. The cough does not repeat. The needle for fuel pressure steadies with an almost theatrical innocence, as if it never trembled. The navigator calls the time. The Met observer keeps his pencil moving. He reads the air as if it were a ledger that will be audited. Wind at this level has eased 2 or 3 knots and turned to shade. Not much, enough to matter. Temperature shows a whisper of warming. The paragraph's inked line tips up by degrees, so small you count them by patience, not by eye. He writes rising slowly because the code does not allow promise. The wireless operator turns the figures into groups and presses them east with even timing, a calm heartbeat in Morse. Now they go. Easting is a relief you don't name yet. The navigator plots a height where a tailwind should come good and suggests a climb back into colder air if the boots keep up. The pilot splits the difference, inching to where true airspeed pays them back and fuel burn does not punish them. The Halifax steadies, less work on the yoke, a finer edge on the rudder. Minutes begin to tilt in their favor. On the ground, the numbers arrive into a machine that can finally use them. At Dunstable, clerks transcribe the code groups and pin them to maps where ship reports have started to show the same gradual change. Winds backing toward the west and northwest, the hard fall of pressure stalling, and then lifting a little. Pilot balloon ascents at a handful of stations put vertical bones under the picture. The differences are marginal and widespread enough to trust. Abundance, not one glorious data point, carries weight. Stagg builds a case out of small things. He has lived with charts that lied by omission. He has stood in rooms where optimism really was impatience. He is cautious by habit and by profession. But the story is changing, and he knows it. A shallow ridge is nosing in behind the low. The front's slope is steepening. If timing holds, cloud bases should lift and winds slacken for a window that straddles the dawn of 6 June. The sea will not be kind, but it will be navigable. The Halifax rides a luster of tailwind now, the sort you feel as the engine note relaxes and the wind in the rigging backs away a few decibels. The navigator updates drift and finds the sideways push almost polite. The Met observer asks for one more level, not greed, but thoroughness. Confirm the easing at height, where fighters and pathfinders will work. They climb into colder air, accept a skin of rime for a minute, and come back to the lair that suits the airplane best. The observer notes the wind and marks rising again. The second time feels less lonely. He sends another set. Static bites at the edges, but the groups go. Somewhere to a shore, a receiver scratches it clean and hands it to a pencil. The wireless operator waits for a request to repeat that does not come. He allows himself a breath that is all exhale. Southwick House has been a room of arguments conducted in clipped courtesy. Naval officers have lived their lives by seas too big for men. They distrust hope. Air commanders care about ceiling and visibility with a ferocity that sounds like superstition and is not. Montgomery wants certainty nobody can sell. The previous evening, the voice of caution won, and the fifth was scrubbed. Now the clock makes their world small. If there is a gap on the 6th, it will be brief. If not, the next viable combination of moon and tide lies many days away, with secrecy bleeding by the hour. Stagg brings the new synthesis in before dawn, and again as daylight grows. He no longer has to swim upstream. American and British forecasters who had sparred over analog patterns and the temptations of historical rhymes converged on the same few sentences, a temporary moderation on the morning of the 6th, then deterioration. The case rests on multiple strands: aircraft winds across the approaches, ships reporting less murderous seas, rising pressures that hold their gains from west to east. Abundance outweighs any one doubt. The Halifax hits another ugly patch, a stutter of bumptious air that makes the horizon, an abstraction in cloud, tilt in the mind. The pilot steadies the descent he did not plan to make and steals back the altitude. He can feel the air smoothing as they slide under the worst of the icing deck. Fuel sits where it has no right to sit this late, which is to say, above empty. He calculates range in minutes and sees home is reachable without borrowing from luck so hard that luck breaks. They take the last readings they can afford. The observer stays clinical. The navigator stays early on every call. The wireless sends a clean final set with a double check on the pressure groups. The code carries a sentence inside it. There is a lid, but not a wall. Winds will be tough, but not cruel. The pulse of pressure says, now or not for a while. In analysis, that pulse mattered more than most viewers of war films ever know. A millibar gained and held across a string of stations told of settling air and a ridge's fragile spine. Wind's backing meant the front had passed, not meandered, and that surface gusts would taper just enough to let cutters, LCAs, and LCTs steer their lines through white water. Aloft, a slight easing offered paratroops a chance to find marked zones without being scattered into hedgerows and ditches beyond help. No promise of smoothness, just the removal of sabotage by weather. At Southwick, the discussion hardens into a choice. Admiral Ramsey's jaw is set. He outlines the risks with the economy of a man who has buried ships. Lee Mallory, whose skepticism about the airborne plan had been documented, weighs in with the forecast in hand. Less resistant now that the ceiling and wind projections inch into tolerable. Montgomery wants the decision. Eisenhower listens, asks for the worst case again, and glances back at the chart where pens mark convoys already committed. Stagg speaks last, as he tends to, and without drama. A brief opportunity on the 6th, followed by a return to poor weather. It will not be ideal, it will be adequate. This is where precision meets chaos and gets to vote. The precision is in the numbers and the discipline that turned them from air into ink into sentences. The chaos is in everything that can still go wrong at sea and in the sky. The decision is a judgment call, not a computation. Eisenhower makes it. He authorizes the move to the 6th. The word travels down corridors, into telephones, along cables, onto signal lamps and sheets tacked to wardroom boards. Continue the operation. On the Halifax, nobody knows which room has tipped, only that the last message has gone and the airplane now owns the return. The island appears first as a smell, peat and salt, and then as a strip of darker dark. The approach is long and spare. Wheels come down like questions. Touchdown is not graceful, but it is straight, which feels like grace tonight. The throttles come back to idle. The engine's rough heat drains, and the air smells like earth again. They taxi in with tanks that would insult any instructor. Ground crew step up into a cockpit where sweat has dried cold, and the wireless operator hands over the flimsy copies of the last transmissions. The observer collects his sheets and the barograph drum, a little barrel of truth wrapped in ink and paper. The navigator marks a last neat line to the field and closes the log. The pilot sits for a second longer than usual with one hand on the yoke because letting go feels like a separate act of flying. By midday ashore, more reports corroborate the shape they hinted at. The ridge keeps its back straight long enough for confidence to harden in men who distrust that word. Orders spool out with the indifference of bureaucracy and the intimacy of consequence. Convoys hold to courses that will bring them to positions off beaches with names they have said so often they are numb to them. Airfields load pathfinders and bombers. Paratroopers wait in kit that isn't warm enough for the air they will climb into. It is not the kind of drama that fills recruiting posters. It is a map changing its mind by increments, and a room agreeing to ride the change. Abundance of observation defeats the scarcity that blinds another headquarters across the water. A message that never uses the word go helps to make go possible. The Halifax crew, who seldom meet drama larger than ice and arithmetic, have fed a decision they will hear about as rumor before it becomes history. When weather makes room, war moves. And in the same hours that one side shapes a window out of numbers, the other stares at the same storm from a thinner horizon and draws a different conclusion. In a Luftwaffe duty room near Paris, a forecaster hunches over a chart illuminated by a shaded lamp. He pencils isobars across the continent with efficient strokes, numbers drawn from stations in Brest, Cherbourg, Paris, Bremen, Oslo. Beyond Ireland, the page is white. Weather ships that once fed this margin are silent or gone. U-boat reports arrive rarely, clipped to seconds by radio discipline meant to keep HFDF hunters at bay. The Atlantic speaks, but to him it is a voice coming through a closed door. German forecasting had been split by service and bound by loss. The Seebetteramt in Hamburg and Luftwaffe meteorologists worked from dense continental networks and a thinning fringe of ocean points. Arctic and Greenland stations had been captured or isolated. Automatic beacons were few and unreliable. The result, by June 1944, was a picture rich over land and poor to the west, where the storms that decide the channel are born. Skilled analysts filled gaps with extrapolation. Extrapolation under pressure tends to repeat what yesterday already said. He draws a deep low centered northwest of the British Isles, its fronts draped across the channel. Winds reported along the French and Belgian coasts remain high. Barometers on the continent still sit low. Showers and low cloud continue over Normandy and Brittany. The area west of Ireland stays unmapped. He writes the obvious conclusion in terse German. Continued bad weather, no large operations likely. The channel, as far as his board shows, is shut. Past doctrine supported the reading. Amphibious operations of scale demanded moderated seas and a lifting ceiling. Luftwaffe 3's staff expected at least 2 days of poor weather before conditions improved. Naval Group West noted strong winds and confused swell at observation points. In reports circulated that night, phrases like "keine größeren Operations zu erwarten" appear. No large operations expected. It was not complacency, it was inference tied to inputs. Rommel takes the road to Germany. He has argued for armor near the beaches and intends to press the point, and he carries a private reason, a birthday at home. He leaves in the belief shared across headquarters that the weather has granted time. Von Rundstedt remains at his command post inland. Other senior officers disperse for consultations and routine. Coastal divisions take cover from rain and wind. Patrols continue. Guns are manned. But the posture is not a general alert aimed at repelling a dawn armada. A flicker of contradiction does cross the wires. A U-boat west of Ireland taps a brief weather group that hints at a slight rise in pressure. An Atlantic station on the far fringe sends a report with winds softening a notch. The fragments do not align into pattern. Without corroboration, a prudent forecaster files them as local variation, noise in a storm that by every nearer measure persists. Absent abundance, scarcity hardens certainty. On the coast, the night feels empty and loud at once. Rain spits against embrasures. Sentries stamp feet under slickers. Coastal radar rotates dutifully, finding patrols and clutter. A battery commander in the Cotton 10 walks the line with a flashlight hooded by a hand and signs off on routine. A message grants some units a few hours of rest after nights of tension. The sea throws white at the base of casements and then drags it away again. The gale has a rhythm men trust. German meteorologists were not careless. They were methodical and trained, working within a system that prized graphs and discipline. But their theater had missing teeth. The pressure surface over the western approaches, where the ridge was forming, appeared only as an extrapolation from land and near-shore points still under the front's slackening edge. The slope of the front, which would determine how fast cloud lifted and winds eased, could not be measured beyond a narrow belt. The best minds in the room could not conjure a ridge they could not see. By the small hours of the 6th, Allied reports showed a brief moderation while the broader pattern remained hostile. German charts still pictured the broad hostility and not the brief. Confidence in bad weather felt prudent and was shared up the chain. At one headquarters, an operations note recommended maintaining alert status for raids and minlaying rather than committing reserves for an invasion response. Luftwaffe night fighters had their own problems in low cloud and rain. Readiness fluctuated with the sky. The reversal, when it comes, begins as a mismatch. Just before dawn, channel winds slacken a touch, not enough to please a fisherman, enough to steady a landing craft's coxswain. Low cloud lifts and bands. Visibility, sullen all night, opens into ranges where a pilot can pick out markers. Offshore, radios wake to traffic that does not match the expected night routine. Coastal lookouts report sighting lights on the horizon that should not exist. The forecaster's map still says storm. The coast begins to say otherwise. A faithful system does what it is fed. In Paris and in Hamburg, morning summaries still lean on the prior state. Storms continue, improvement later. The armada that has used the small improvement is already too close to disentangle with air or sea alone. Rommel, racing back, will be hours away when the news resolves into a fact. Commanders on the ground will improvise gallantly and brutally within frameworks that were not tuned this morning to meet a mass landing announced by wind and pressure rise rather than by a general alarm. Abundance versus scarcity does not only belong to weapons and fuel. It lives in the weather room. With fewer upstream observations, German forecasters extended trends. With more, Allied forecasters detected a turn. That difference, compounded by normal human caution about outliers, shaped posture and pace on both shores. Confidence, built on what could be seen, became a liability when what mattered lay beyond the line of sight. The coast quiets, then changes timbre. From concrete sills and slit windows, men begin to hear an undertone, a low growl that swells until it becomes surf plus engines, plus something new that does not stop. The maps that kept faith with missing data will be redrawn. The diaries and signals they produced will outlast the men who wrote them. We can follow those papers to see exactly where the blind spot lived, and how a few millibars became time, and how time became ships on the horizon. The sky relents just enough. Low cloud thins into torn bands, the wind eases a notch, and gray water lines up into something a coxswain can read. Paratroopers step into the slipstream and drop through scudding layers to beacons that finally appear. Pathfinders plant light, not luck. Offshore, cutters and LCAs shoulder surf and keep their bearings. Bombers find marked lanes and let go where they mean to, not by guess. The window is narrow but real, and men pour through it. By afternoon, the weather hardens again, but the beachheads are ashore and linked by effort more than elegance. The day gives barely what was asked, and nothing more, which is enough to change the war's arithmetic. Reports from the beaches and from the fleets read like receipts. Cloud base lifted enough for fighter cover in pulses. The wind backed and slackened into workable ranges. Visibility improved unevenly, but sufficiently. The following day told the other half of the truth. On 7 June, squalls returned, whitecaps sharpened, and low cloud pressed down again, complicating air support and resupply. That worsening did not erase the gains, it confirmed the judgment. Had the invasion gone on the 5th, many landing craft would have met the channel at its angriest, and Pathfinder crews would have searched for ground they could not see. The delay bought survival, not comfort, and the risk taken to fetch the final measurements paid off in a currency that looked like minutes gained and lives not lost. Overlord changed doctrine as surely as it changed maps. Commanders who had treated weather as backdrop made it a system. The Allies had already built abundance, coastal stations, weather ships, aircraft tracks, but after June 1944, that network became muscle memory. Naval task forces sailed with embedded forecasters whose word could reroute convoys. Long-range reconnaissance evolved into hardy bombers, into dedicated flights, dropping SONs into storm corps. Weather ships held lonely stations across the North Atlantic for decades, feeding the first numerical models. Within a generation, satellites began to watch the same ridges and fronts from above, and global data links closed gaps that once forced men to guess. The language did not change much, wind, pressure, cloud, but the instruments multiplied and the authority of the forecast hardened into procedure. The lesson was simple and purchased. Treat the atmosphere like an adversary you can map, and plan as if courage depends on it. The night we followed was not a duel of aces or a charge at wire. It was precision wrestled from chaos by people who would never see the beaches their numbers served. Doctrine gave them checklists. Improvisation kept them alive long enough to complete them. The difference between abundance and scarcity was not abstract. It lived in a warmed pitot head, a steady key on a wireless set, a barograph drum wrapped in ink that could be trusted by a man in a room far away. Mac and his crew did not get to choose the storm. They chose to read it well. That is a kind of courage older soldiers recognize, the discipline to hold a standard in conditions that tried to make a liar of it. The invasion owed them nothing and everything. Nothing in fame, everything in margin. If this story speaks to you, continue the weather war thread. Watch our micro-history on the BBC's coded Verlaine broadcast, Chanson d'automne, and how a few lines quietly primed sabotage. Then join our tactical deep dive on the Battle of the Bulge, when fog and snow blinded both sides. Listen for the poem that opened doors, then trace the winter sky that closed them.